My father set my duffel bag on the front porch, locked the door behind him, and told me through the screen that I'd be begging on the street inside of a month. I was 19 years old. It was raining, and I had $400 and a bus pass to my name. 15 years later, I signed the lease on my 14th restaurant in the same city, 6 blocks from that same house. And I still haven't decided whether I'm going to invite them to the opening. I want you to sit with that number for a second because it took me a long time to actually believe it myself. 14 restaurants, 200 and something employees, depending on the season. A life built entirely out of the wreckage of one rainy September night when my own parents decided the fastest way to fix a 19-year-old's mistakes was to make sure she had nowhere left to go. Welcome back to Hidden Truth Stories. This is the channel for the people who got written off early. And what happens 15 years later when the story doesn't end where everyone assumed it would. If a story like this feels familiar, drop a comment and let me know. And before we go further, where are you watching from tonight? Type your city below. I read every single one. My name is Dana Okafor. I'm 34 now, and I own a small restaurant group here in Atlanta. 14 locations across 3 concepts, employing enough people that I genuinely lose count sometimes when someone asks. 15 years ago, none of that existed. 15 years ago, I was a 19-year-old college dropout standing on my parents' porch with a duffel bag, watching my father lock a door I'd grown up walking through without a second thought. The mistake that got me there wasn't dramatic in the grand scheme of things, though it felt catastrophic at the time. I'd dropped out of a pre-med program my parents had spent years building me toward, quietly, without telling them. For almost an entire semester before they found out through a tuition refund notice that arrived in the mail. I hadn't dropped out to do nothing. I'd dropped out because I'd taken a job in a restaurant kitchen the previous summer on what I told my parents was a temporary thing to make some extra money, and had discovered, almost by accident, the first thing in my entire life that had ever made me feel genuinely, completely alive. My parents did not see it that way. My father, a cardiologist, and my mother, a hospital administrator, had built their entire understanding of a successful life around a very specific, very narrow set of coordinates. And a kitchen job wasn't on the map anywhere they recognized. When the refund notice arrived, my father sat me down at the kitchen table, the same table I'd done homework at for 18 years, and asked me, calmly, coldly, exactly how I planned to explain to the extended family that I'd thrown away a pre-med scholarship to flip burgers. I tried to explain it wasn't burgers. I tried to explain the sous chef who'd started teaching me knife skills, the strange, total focus that came over me during a dinner rush. The way I'd started staying 2 hours past the end of my shift just to watch the pastry chef work, unpaid, because I wanted to understand it that badly. My father listened to almost none of it. What he said instead, verbatim, close enough that I've never forgotten it, was, "You have exactly 1 week to enroll back in that program, or you can find somewhere else to live, because I'm not funding a delusion." I didn't re-enroll. Partly out of a stubbornness I'm not sure I fully understood in myself at 19, and partly because some quiet, terrified part of me already knew, with a certainty I couldn't yet explain to anyone, including myself, that the kitchen was where I actually belonged. 1 week later, almost to the hour, my father set my bag on the porch. If you've ever had your family draw a hard line around what counted as a real future for you, tell me in the comments. What did they say when you didn't choose the path they wanted? My mother didn't come out onto the porch that night. I found out much later, from an aunt who eventually told me the truth long after the fact, that she'd stood in the hallway the entire time, silent, and hadn't objected once. Not because she agreed, but because in that house, my father's decisions simply weren't something you contradicted out loud, even when you privately thought they were wrong. I spent the first 3 nights sleeping on the couch of a coworker from the restaurant, a line cook named Marisol who'd clocked, correctly, that something was badly wrong when I showed up to my shift with a duffel bag and hadn't slept. She didn't ask many questions. She just handed me a blanket and told me the couch was mine as long as I needed it, which ended up being closer to 5 months than 3 nights. I picked up every extra shift the restaurant would give me. I learned fast the specific mathematics of poverty that nobody in my previous life had ever had to teach me. How far $400 actually stretches when you're paying for a bus pass, cheap groceries, and nothing else. How to make one uniform last a week between washes. How exhaustion has its own particular flavor when it's compounded by not knowing, some nights, whether you'll have anywhere to sleep the following month. What I did not do in all of that was call my parents. I want to be honest about how much that cost me, because pride is a strange, expensive thing to hold on to at 19 with $400 and a couch that isn't yours. There were nights I genuinely considered it, dialing the first 6 digits of my parents' number before hanging up, telling myself I wasn't ready yet, not entirely sure what I was actually waiting to become ready for. By the time I turned 20, I'd moved from line cook to prep lead, mostly through sheer obsessive repetition. Showing up early, staying late, asking the kind of relentless questions that either endear you to a kitchen or get you fired from one, depending on the kitchen. Mine, thankfully, was the first kind. The owner, a gruff, exacting man named Theo, who'd built the place from a single food truck over 20 years, started giving me small pieces of responsibility that had nothing to do with cooking at all. Ordering, scheduling, eventually, cautiously, some early exposure to the actual numbers behind running a restaurant, the margins, the labor costs, the brutal, unforgiving math that determines whether a place survives its first 3 years or doesn't. I discovered, almost as unexpectedly as I'd discovered my love for the kitchen itself, that I was good at that math. Genuinely good, in a way that surprised even Theo, who started, half joking at first, calling me his numbers girl during slow afternoon prep shifts. At 23, with 3 years of saved wages, a small business loan I nearly didn't qualify for, and a location Theo helped me negotiate because the landlord trusted his reputation more than mine, I opened my first restaurant. 9 seats at the counter, 4 small tables, a menu built entirely around the specific unglamorous Nigerian dishes my grandmother used to make, the ones nobody in my parents' house had ever wanted at the dinner table, because they weren't, in my mother's words from years earlier, what people expect from us. Second question for you. If you were building something entirely on your own, with no safety net, would you have reached back out to family the moment things got hard, or waited, the way I did, until you had something to show them? That first restaurant lost money for the first 8 months, which is ordinary, unremarkable math for a new small business, though it didn't feel ordinary living it. I worked every station myself most nights, closed the register at 1 a.m, opened again at 6 for prep, slept in genuinely uncomfortable increments for most of that first year. Somewhere around month 9, a local food writer, entirely by accident, wandered in on a slow Tuesday, ordered the jollof rice, and wrote a review 2 weeks later that changed the entire trajectory of that small 9-seat restaurant almost overnight. I didn't know, at the time, that my mother read that same local paper every single week, the way she had my entire childhood. I found out later, from that same aunt, that she'd seen the review, seen my name in print for the first time in 4 years, and hadn't told my father for nearly 2 months, unsure, I think, of what to do with information that didn't fit the story she'd allowed herself to believe about how my life had turned out. The second restaurant opened 18 months after the first, a slightly larger space, 2 neighborhoods over, and the third came 14 months after that. By 28, I had 5 locations and had hired Marisol, the coworker whose couch had saved me at 19, as my director of operations, a title she'd earned through the exact same relentless competence that had gotten her a management position at her own restaurant years earlier, one I was genuinely proud to poach her from. My father reached out for the first time when I was 29, 7 restaurants in by then, through a formal, oddly stiff email rather than a phone call, congratulating me on an award my third location had recently received. An award covered, briefly, in a business journal he apparently still read. The email was 3 sentences long. It did not mention the porch. It did not mention the 5 months on Marisol's couch, or the $400, or the year I'd genuinely wondered whether I'd made the right decision at all. It simply said he'd seen the article and hoped things were going well. I didn't respond for 6 weeks. When I finally did, I kept my own response equally brief, thanking him for reaching out, without offering anything more than that, because I hadn't yet decided, and honestly still hadn't fully decided even now, exactly how much of that relationship I was interested in rebuilding, and on whose terms. My mother called, separately, about a year after that, her voice smaller than I remembered it, and asked, almost shyly, whether she could come see one of the restaurants sometime. I said yes, cautiously, and she came alone, without my father, to my 4th location on a quiet Sunday afternoon. She ordered the jollof rice. She cried, quietly, over it, in a way I didn't fully understand until she told me, haltingly, that it tasted almost exactly like her own mother's. The grandmother I'd learned it from, the one my mother had spent most of my childhood keeping at arm's length from our own family table. If this story is hitting a nerve, subscribe so the next one finds you. And tell me honestly, would you have let your parents back in as cautiously as I did? Or kept the door closed the way your 19-year-old self might have wanted to? I signed the lease on my 14th restaurant 3 months ago, in a rapidly developing corridor 6 blocks from the house I grew up in. The same house whose porch I sat on with a duffel bag 15 years earlier, waiting for a ride I hadn't yet arranged. It wasn't a deliberate choice, exactly, at least not consciously. The location made sense on every ordinary business metric: foot traffic, demographics, rent relative to projected revenue. It was only after signing that I fully registered the symbolism of it, sitting in my car outside the empty space, looking down the street toward a house I could just barely see the roofline of. My relationship with my parents today exists somewhere in a careful, deliberately maintained middle distance. My mother and I talk regularly now, warmly even, in a way that still occasionally catches me off guard given how far we traveled to get there. My father and I are more formal, more careful, 2 people who've agreed, mostly without ever explicitly saying so, to build something new rather than pretend the old thing was never broken. He's visited 2 of my restaurants. He's never once, in 15 years, said the words, "I was wrong" out loud, though he did at my mother's 4th location visit, quietly leave a much larger tip than the bill required, which I've decided, for my own peace of mind, to accept as the closest version of an apology he's capable of giving. I think about that 19-year-old on the porch more often than I'd probably admit to most people. I don't think about her with pity anymore, the way I did for years. I think about her with something closer to gratitude. Strange as that sounds, because everything I've actually built, the 14 restaurants, the 200 employees, the entire life I now genuinely love, exists specifically because that porch closed the way it did, forcing a decision I might never have had the courage to make on my own terms otherwise. I have not, as of tonight, decided whether to invite my parents to the opening of that 14th location. Some days I think I will. Some days the answer is a firm, immediate no, rooted in a version of myself that still remembers exactly how cold that rain was. Exactly how long $400 can feel like it's going to have to last. I've stopped rushing myself toward a decision either way because I've learned, over 15 years of building something entirely my own, that some things are actually allowed to stay unresolved for as long as they need to. So tell me honestly in the comments, should I invite them to the opening, or does 15 years of silence and 1 porch light still owed something more before that door reopens all the way? Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, and let me know where you're watching from tonight. I still make my grandmother's jollof rice myself, personally, once a week, at whichever location I happen to be working that day. The same recipe, the same specific way she taught me before I ever knew it would become the thing that saved my entire life. Some inheritances aren't written into any will. Some of them just get handed down in a kitchen, one recipe at a time, whether anyone ever meant for them to matter that much or not.